Did you think you'd get away with it?
Shadow.
Did you think I wouldn't know?
I am justice.
You'll burn for murder, you'll burn.
As inevitable as your guilty conscience.
Retribution personified, vengeance made flesh, the prince of the pulps, sire of the superheroes, receptacle of more pale imitation than a Michael Jackson impersonators convention, by whatever name, employing whatever descriptor, the inimitable Shadow has weathered nearly a full century of fiscal turpitudes, publisher buyouts, plagiarism, and licensing snafus. He survived the death of radio, he weathered the comic book crash, he persists in the age of piracy, and through it all, he continues to have relevant stories to tell and adventures to imbibe in all the way in 2016. After the almighty Daredevil, this would be my favorite comic book hero, but to refer to him as such is to do the character immeasurable disservice, for the Shadow was at one time a titan of all media. It is not exaggeration whatsoever to say that throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the Shadow was objectively bigger than the DC and Marvel comic heroes he would ultimately inspire, and not merely at that time. Listen to me here, folks, and really absorb the enormity of what I'm imparting to you. The Shadow, in his prime, was more popular and made infinitely more money than Superman, Spider-Man, or even his plagiarized progeny Batman in their prime, and I say that with every awareness. Superman 78, bigger by a lot. Batman 89, don't make me laugh, I'm not as good at it as the Shadow.
The Shadow.
The Dark Knight? Not even close. One of the reasons the untrammeled dominance of the Shadow has been lost to the ether of time is because most of us were either not alive or have simply forgotten how massive radio was as a format. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, radio had the popularity and adoption rates of television with a reach that television arguably never achieved. You didn't just hear the radio at home, you took it with you. Transistor radios, car radio, you heard music and radio dramas blasting from windows on a sweltering summer day. You heard it at work, saw it in shop windows. Radio in its prime was everywhere. Now, accepting that premise, I hope you'll now understand the import when I divulge that the Shadow was, for an uninterrupted 15-year stretch, the highest rated radio drama in existence and the highest rated thing on daytime radio, full stop. From 1937 to 1954, there was no more recognizable vigilante in all of popular fiction. From films to radio to serials, novels, coloring books, and of course the bedrock of comics and the pulps, Lamont Cranston's crusade on crime had conquered every form of popular media, and then, as suddenly as he appeared, the Shadow had melted back into the darkness from whence he came. Well, roll up your sleeves, Rageaholics, because I think it's high fucking time for a bona fide revival. To that end, today I'll be proffering the top 5 Shadow comics according to yours truly. Though the Shadow has conquered virtually all media, as I said, and though I thoroughly recommend reading through the supremely entertaining Pulps, all of which are slowly coming back into print, by the way, his forays into the realm of comics represent some of the most underrated graphic novels in the medium. Consider this your Shadow starter kit. So with no further delay, let us draw back the cloak and enter the Dark Avenger himself, the Shadow. When Dynamite Entertainment acquired the Shadow license several years back, I won't pretend it didn't elicit an eye roll. After all, the house that Variant Covers built is hardly known for their artistic acumen. This is a publisher that thought a silver-plated onesie and some turd-wave feminist dogma constitutes a Red Sonja reboot. Spoiler alert, it goddamn doesn't. This is a company that publishes a fucking Grumpy Cat comic, for crying out loud, where print 'em cheap and stack 'em deep is the modus operandi ad infinitum. Gesundheit. But all that changed when famed Grendel scribe Matt Wagner rolled the fuck into Dodge. Look, steeped in crime fiction of the 40s, Wagner appointed himself Grand Poobah of all pulpdom, crafting what has since proven to be the definitive Shadow origin story, one that assembles the essential elements of the character, subverts enough to eschew any accusations of superfluity, while never explaining so much that the mythos sheds the essential mystery and allure intrinsic to the Shadow, something even the almighty Batman Year One was wasn't entirely successful at, if I'm being honest. Yet, the Shadow Year 1 pulls it the fuck off. Now, the operative logic at Dynamite, and sadly increasingly at Marvel and DC as well, appears to be hire famous writer, attach to famous character, abduct any South American asshole who can hold a pencil to illustrate the fucking thing, provided they're willing to work for $5 in a reach around per hour. And while that still holds true for the books in question, occasionally, the end result rises above the sum of its parts. Sure, I've seen more detailed line work than Wilfredo Torres, and his storytelling isn't likely to be compared favorably to the likes of John Romita Jr. or Jack Kirby in the immediate future, but when all the elements congeal, Shadow Year 1 ascends to its rightful place among the great origin stories in all of comics. If you want to know who the fuck the Shadow is and why the fuck he be shadowing, Year 1 is your butt fucking Bible. There's really no tactful way of putting this, so fuck it. Batman. Yes, that Batman, most celebrated of all superheroes, the titular protagonist of a wildly successful video game series that should have ended 2 games ago. The character often described as the single most original hero in existence, and as a Batman fan, this hurts to say, is a work of plagiarism. Blatant plagiarism. And for once, this is not even up for debate. For the blathering homunculi who are doubtless penning a witless rejoinder in the comments section before even knowing all the facts, you're wrong before you typed a word, you cunt. Most cases of plagiarism are more subjective. The author's shrewd or canny enough to camouflage their counterfeiting with misdirection or a few strategically rearranged names and places, but not Bob Kane and Bill Finger, boy, the latter of whom outright admitted the theft rather conveniently decades after the statute of limitations had already expired, while DC have recently packaged the flagrant cribbing as inspiration. One fleeting glance at the Shadow pulp novel by the name of Partners of Peril reveals the first appearance of Batman to be one of the most brazen, appalling, line-for-line, panel-for-panel Xerox jobs in the history of comics. Look, I love Batman. I've recommended his comics on my channel. In fact, I probably wouldn't have even mentioned this at all if DC Comics hadn't been for the last 75 years trumpeting the peerless originality of Batman.
There will never be a better mass vigilante, I think, in fiction, because Batman is the one. And I don't think any other character in fiction has had more stories told about them than Batman.
And when the truth is that from his cape, to his Dracula obsession, to the pistols he was packing in the inaugural issues, to his billionaire playboy alter ego,
the Shadow is all dressed in black. Batman is all dressed in black. The Shadow is really Playboy Lamont Cranston, wealthy man about town. Batman is really Bruce Wayne, Playboy and wealthy man about town. Batman, he's the comics version of the Shadow.
Is not only not original, if Street and Smith had been more on the ball, they might have done to DC Comics, justifiably, what DC Comics unfairly did to the creators of Shazam. Look it up, asshole. Fortunately, in the early 70s, with Denny O'Neil laboring mightily to return Batman to his Dark Knight roots against editorials expressed wishes, the decision was made to at least give a sort of inspirational nod to the Knight of Darkness. And no, I didn't make that up. Long before Batman showed up, the Shadow was referred to as the Knight of Darkness. Fucking oops. The end result, one crossover to rule them all. A geriatric Shadow comes face to face with his unofficial protege, Batman, and it goes without saying that the Shadow comes off as a bona fide badass. So successful was the pairing that the two would meet again just a few issues later, but you owe it to yourself to read this shit. Batman number 253, get it. After DC Comics resurrected the character in 1986 via a well-received but eminently controversial Howard Chaykin miniseries, then corkscrewed the character into the fucking foundation with a 1987 ongoing follow-up set in the modern day, culminating in an unqualified goat fuck wherein the Shadow's head was severed and attached to a cybernetic butt-fucking body. Gee, can you tell RoboCop had recently been released? It was abundantly clear to all of Christendom that DC Comics had defaulted on their possession of a fucking clue, and then Marvel rode to the rescue with their first and to date only Shadow offering. Licensing the character for just one graphic novel, the House of Ideas returned the Knight of Darkness to his roots, transporting him back to his appropriate time period, divesting him of his robo-dick and reacquainting him with fellow Shadow agents Burbank, Margot Lane, and the long-lost inaugural agent Harry Vincent. And did I mention he fights Nazis? Because the Shadow fights fucking Nazis! As if you couldn't tell from the title, the Shadow 1941, Hitler's Astrologer. And who delineates the story in question? Well, perennial scribe Denny O'Neil and the mighty Michael Kaluta. While some have criticized the stiffness of Kaluta's work and the story in question, I consider this a cut above his traditional Shadow work. More detailed, far more polished line work, and with a wood-etched, cross-hatched quality that provided immense inspiration for my own comic art. Kaluta's work has never looked so pristine or professional as on this stellar graphic novel. Best of all, the comic sold exceptionally well, and thus there are many copies of the commemorative hardcover floating around the nebulous ether of online retail for insultingly low prices. Hell, I've tracked down copies of the Shadow 1941 in one of the 5 remaining brick-and-mortar comic stores, no less, for all of $1. For that price, don't be a bitch, buy it! One of the Shadow's truly persistent maladies throughout all his comic book iterations has been the absence of a strong, long-term, ongoing comic. Look, a standalone graphic novel or 4-issue miniseries is all well and good, but when your character's persisted for nearly a full century and has yet to produce an ongoing series in excess of 31 issues, you know there's something very wrong with your comic book licensing strategy. The most successful attempt to lift the aforementioned curse arrived in 1989 with DC Comics' superlative, The Shadow Strikes. As if throttled back into coherence by Marvel's stellar reassertion of the classic Shadow character's self-evident virtues, DC answered the game of unspoken one-upsmanship with an unapologetic love letter to the original pulp version of the character, with more than a few ingenious tributes to the radio show thrown in for good measure. In one particular fourth-wall-breaking flourish, the Shadow confronts a young actor, in no way to be confused with Orson Welles, for impersonating him on the radio, only to realize that the radio show strikes such abject terror into the hearts of criminals that it's worth leaving on the air. And in a particularly inspired allusion to the War of the Worlds, he remarks that Welles' towering talent is such that he could convince listeners of an invasion to Mars. To which the aspiring actor remarks, I'll have to keep that in mind. So numerous are the Easter eggs from the Pulps and radio, I almost recommend you treat yourself to them first, because while the stories work supremely well on their own, the added narrative links to the past are what truly marks the Shadow Strikes as the Dark Avenger's finest hour in comics, for simultaneously reintroducing and deepening the established Shadow mythos, in the process conferring unforeseen nuance to characters that even by that point were 3/4 of a century old. Writer Gerard Jones is to be eternally commended. If I have one gripe, though, it's with the angular line work of artist Eduardo Barreto, I believe. While it ultimately grew on me like a fucking colon polyp, I'm just not a fan of expressionist, angular, sketchy comic art. Look, I like shit to look like whatever the fuck it's supposed to look like. It's a comic, not a fucking Rorschach. Fortunately, about halfway through, the much more photorealistic Rod Wiggum hops on the book and helms it to completion. I've heard Shadow fans espouse the exact opposite position, but, sorry, bitch, you're just plain wrong. But ain't nothing wrong about the Shadow Strikes. And with high print runs during the comic boom of the late 80s, back issues are every bit as cheap as they are easy to find. Buy that shit! comic book's answer to film noir masterpiece The Naked City, and that it's told not from the Shadow's perspective, but from that of an entire metropolis. While Coils of Leviathan's canonical status is left deliberately ambiguous, veteran Shadow artist and now for the first time writer Michael Kaluta is to be commended for attempting a project of such staggering scope, confining it to just 4 issues, and actually pulling it off. No mean feat for someone accustomed to illustrating someone else's Shadow scripts, punctuated by the florid deep purple prose of the poem My City, a kind of Shadow manifesto, and one that I can state without reservation positively nails the fire and brimstone binary objectivism inherent in the pulp version of the character. I mean, just kick back and listen to some of this Victorian venom, and it comes into such immediate, pristine clarity why the Shadow is much, much more violent and sadistic than, for example, Frank Castle. Without the spur of retribution, your crime becomes mundane, your evil intent and uncontrolled inconsideration gliding toward the salivic pool of insipid pastime, a sort of breathing puppet gesture with no effort of personal involvement, while you cry that you're owed a living by the world. The crime of your crime becomes insult in addition to injury, the unasked question I take as mine to answer. As you fall through the night, my laughter follows. I will laugh behind you for the ones you gracelessly pillaged of their belief and hope. Will you tell me now of your self-loathing, your bile, your illness of spirit and substance, of your inner betrayal, your inner affliction, as if I didn't know? In my laughter you will hear my final judgment. Tell it to the worms. Jesus fuck, Shadow, have a cigarette and a poop, my man. The Shadow, you see, is not a crime fighter. He is an agent of vengeance, an elemental instrument of inviolate justice. His arch nemesis isn't some criminal in clown paint, although it's interesting to note that the Shadow was hunting down a clown-painted serial killer, about 8 years before Batman was. No, his only adversary is evil itself. While Batman, Daredevil, and even the Punisher are content to fight street-level crime, put the bad guy away, or even kill him and go on about their business, the Shadow massacres them in totality. He murders them gleefully, cackling from the darkness like a jackal, relishing their misfortune in abject terror as he matches evil with evil. And just before the moment of death, it's his pleasure to recite high-handed, verbose soliloquies detailing precisely why their gruesome fate is right and justified. This, incidentally, is why the Silver Shroud character from a side quest in Fallout 4, just one of many tributes to the Shadow in Bethesda games over the years, speaks like he deep-throated a thesaurus.
Peddling poison to kids, are we? Today, you face the Silver Shroud.
Now pair that objectivist vitriol with Kaluta's stunning Art Nouveau renditions of the Dark Avenger, and I will unequivocally argue now and for all time that no Shadow comic more embodies the character than the Shadow in the Coils of Leviathan. Read it, bitch! Well, that does it for today's Descent into Darkness. If you dig any of these, I may have a few more recommendations on the horizon outside of comics in the future. Whether it's the 40s serials, the 94 Alec Baldwin film, the Orson Welles radio show, or the Pulps. Hell, I'll break a cardinal rule of my show and plug a podcast for a beat. The excellent Shadow Fan Podcast. Look it up, or there'll be a link below, bitch tits. Grab a shovel and dig the fuck in, because the Shadow mythos is rich indeed. I love this character, and as you can see on screen right now, I have since childhood. And if I can turn even one of you onto this pop culture treasure, well then my work here is done. Until next time, I'm Razor Fist. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
My thoughts are hard to miss.
Why is that?
Psychically, I'm very well endowed.
I'll bet you are.